Here this morning. Been blessed already this morning. Good, great music. You don't get much better object lesson than that. We talk about God's faithfulness, but it's great that we see that put before us and we understand just how faithful our God is. This morning, I'm glad you're here with us. We're gonna get into our fourth and our final message in our series. We've been on a series called King-Sized Counsel, and so this is kind of the fourth and final one. Although I was kind of studying. And we could have done this for about 43 weeks, I guess, if we wanted to. If you looked at all the kings that Israel and Judah had combined, Israel had 20, Judah had 20, and then they had 3 prior to the kingdoms kind of splitting. And that's a great trivia question. Who were the 3 kings prior to the kingdom splitting? We'll do a little Bible trivia this morning. Anybody? Troy? Awesome. Yeah, I don't know what you get to go to the front of the line at potluck. That's what you get this morning. You get in first. Yeah, it was King Saul, King David, and King Solomon were the kings that were there over the United Kingdom, and after that, everything kind of split up, broke up, and everything. But if you've been here along the way, we kind of recapped a little bit last week. Let me remind you, we've talked about 3 kings up to this point, and we talked about Rehoboam, and what we learned, hopefully, from Rehoboam is that when we don't set our hearts on seeking the Lord, really, in real ways, things go south. Things really do. I mean, not just figuratively in the sense that kingdom got broken up and Rehoboam and Judah and Benjamin ended up going south, but things really go south. They go south for our lives when we don't set our hearts on seeking the Lord, when our hearts are set on so many other things. And then we talked about a guy by the name of Zedekiah, and through Zedekiah, hopefully we learned that with rebellion comes pain. With rebellion comes pain. And that God uses pain not in a way to pay us back, but to win us back. He tries to get our attention. Hopefully, a lot of us here this morning that are parents, you understand that when you're disciplining your children, hopefully it's not because you're vengeful or you're trying to pay them back for their wrong. You're trying to win them back and change their behavior, change their perspective. That's, I hope, if that's not your motivation, then, Brother Steve has counseling hours, later on. But that hopefully is the motivation we have when we discipline our kids. It's the same motivation our Heavenly Father has when He interacts in our lives and brings things painful sometimes. Sometimes it's to say, hey, wake up. You need to change your direction. You need to change your perspective. And then last week, we talked about the most evil king of all of Israel's kings. And this guy's name was Ahab. And we learned that the things we covet are the things we crown king. That if that's all you're focusing on, then that takes control of your life. And we found out, remember we talked about it last week, how do you know you've stepped over the line? It begins to control your emotions, and it begins to control your actions. And we understand that when that starts to happen, whatever that thing is, when I get incredibly emotional about it, and it starts to control not only my emotions, but controls my actions, I've crossed the line. I'm coveting something other than God and that relationship with Him. And so hopefully we've learned a few things. I don't know about you, but for the most part, as I've looked over some of the lessons and the messages we've talked about over the last few weeks, what I've found in my life is what not to do. That's I kind of thought about this. Over 3 weeks, we've learned a lot of what not to do. Matter of fact, if we were to hang, how many of you guys have seen those motivational posters? Anybody have any of those in your offices, or maybe you have like a little thing? I have one of those. A good friend of ours gave me a little picture kind of a thing, plaque that sits in my office right now. And when we were leaving California, dear friends and of ours, when we were getting ready to come out this way and get a new church started, she gave me this little plaque, and it said "Risk," and it has a sailboat like out in the middle of the ocean. And it says one of those things like, you will never discover new lands if you don't have the courage to leave the shore. And I think a lot of us have seen those inspirational posters and stuff. But if we were to hang an inspirational poster in the office of the kings of Israel, it would probably look something like this. Mistakes. It could be that the purpose of your life is to only serve as a warning to others. And maybe some of you can relate to that. Matter of fact, I thought this was interesting. Anybody, I don't know if you can you see the website that we found? Yeah, if you ever want to be just really encouraged, go to despair.com. That's it's pretty powerful stuff there. But this morning, I'd like for us to change our perspective a little bit, and instead of taking notes on what not to do, I'd like for us to look at a particular king and in him see some things that we should do. And by the way, in case we lose track, doing is what matters. Doing is what makes all the difference. It's not enough just to show up and kind of hear God's word. And I think sometimes in our Western culture, in our Western church society, we believe, well, I get brownie points with God because I showed up this Sunday morning and I sat in some chairs or I sat in some rows or whatever it may be. Understand, that doesn't count. It doesn't even count to come to church and hear a message and actually feel convicted. That doesn't matter either. That doesn't count. We don't get credit for just showing up or just feeling convicted. Think about this. You don't make progress in your relationship with God. You don't go deeper in that relationship with God until you do something. Until you do something. And I think most of us understand that in the real world, right? We all pretty much get that. All of us have probably bought exercise equipment. We've all done that. And we believe by the purchase, and we bought some fancy stuff and some sneakers, Brother Chris. We got some tennis shoes. We got stuff. We're ready to go. You don't get faster. You don't get healthier until you do something with that equipment, other than hang your clothes on it. You actually have to do something. And we understand that in the real world, but for some reason we think in spiritual things, that's not how it works. That I get deeper in my relationship with God because I show up or I feel something. James, the brother of Jesus, would actually write these words. He says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only. And then he tags this little piece at the end, deceiving yourself. Living your life deluded and deceived. He said, you're deceiving yourself if you think you just show up and you hear something and maybe you shed a tear or maybe that object lesson and great is thy faithfulness, man, it just hit your heart and there was some tears. And that's okay, but don't let it stop there. Don't let it stop there. We have to do something. And so this morning, as we unpack some of the things we see in the life of this king, my prayer is that you're not just taking notes. And that's cool that you are. I'm not telling you not to take notes. But what I've really been praying this week is that God will give us the courage to take action. Because it's not about just hearing it. It's not about jotting it down. It's not about feeling convicted. It's about doing something. Because doing is what makes all the difference. And so this morning, I'd like to introduce us to a king by the name of Hezekiah. How many of you have heard of this guy before? Heard of Hezekiah? A few of you. Awesome. Let me share just a little. Let me give you a little bit of backstory about Hezekiah real quick. Hezekiah would become the 13th king over the southern kingdom of Judah. He was lucky number 13 in the string of 20 kings. And he would take over the throne from his father. His father's name was Ahaz. And Hezekiah would take over the throne at 25 years old. And I thought about that. Perfect fairy tale life, right? You're 25. And they hand you, it's like, they're 25 and they kind of like hand you the keys to the Ferrari. It's like you're 25 and you get to wear the crown, you get to wear the robe, you get to be called sir or royal sir or whatever it may be, and they kind of bow, you're the king. And I thought about this, I remember being 25 years old, kind of, it's a little bit back, but I remember thinking, I'm kind of the king. Life was good. Carrie and I had only been married a couple years. Things were good, and thought you had the world, by the tail. You just thought you were the king. This guy actually was the king. He was the king. He didn't have to think about it. He actually was. But let me share with you, as wonderful as that sounds, and as great as that sounds, Hezekiah's life wasn't exactly what you would call perfect. Let me read you a verse. And if you have Bibles with you, that's cool. 2 Kings 16 in that area. We'll be bouncing a little bit between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, so we'll have a lot of the verses up here this morning, but if you want to reference, that's perfectly great. You can kind of read the story. I don't know about you, the only problem I ever had in church was as they would read a verse, and I'm not telling you not to read the verse, I want you to do that, but I always kind of kept just reading the stories through, and the guy up front, and it was usually my grandfather when I was young, kept talking, and I'm just like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I'm just reading the story. But this morning, go look at those verses, and I want you to understand how this all comes together. But I want you to look at Hezekiah's life. It wasn't as perfect and as fairy tale as maybe we would think it would be. It says this about this Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 2, it says this. It says, Ahaz, this is Hezekiah's dad, was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God. I want us to just press pause here for a moment, because maybe just hearing that kind of hits close to home for some people. Maybe you didn't grow up in a Christian home, and maybe dad wasn't the spiritual leader, or maybe dad wasn't even around at all. Maybe there wasn't a good example to follow. And maybe for some of you, dad was there, and maybe mom was there, and there was a lot of Christian phrases used in home, and there were a lot of church events attended, but outside of that, there just wasn't a lot of Christ influence seen. Anybody relate to that a little bit? That, boy, we went to church a lot, and we used a lot of Christian phrases when it was appropriate, but outside of that, we didn't see Christ being evidenced in our family and in our lives on an everyday basis. And things may have looked really good from the outside, but you knew the truth of what was happening inside. This was an environment that Hezekiah knew very well. He knew that environment. He knew the environment of a dad that didn't follow God. And he knew the environment. Maybe some people said some God stuff, but nobody's living it out. That's the environment that he was brought up in. Not only was Hezekiah's home environment difficult, but the cultural environment with which he lived and where he was brought up was also really challenging. And we're not going to take the time to read all of 2 Kings chapter 17, but in the middle of this chapter, if you were to continue reading on to chapter 17, in the middle of this chapter, there's a couple of verses that paint this incredibly bleak picture of what life was like in Judah and Israel at the time that Hezekiah was growing up. It gives us a picture of what things were like there. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 13, verses 14, it says this. It says, "Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, 'Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you by my servants, the prophets.'" And then listen to this. He said, so God's he's sending all of his preachers. I mean, everybody's out there and saying, hey, we have gotten off track. We're not following God. Not only are we as a people not following God, our kings aren't following God, our government's not following God. Anybody resonating at all today? Okay, cool. He says this, "Nevertheless, they would not hear. They would not hear, but stiffened their necks, like the necks of their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God." That was always a strange phrase to me growing up. I remember my grandfather preaching when I was a kid, and he talked about being a stiff-necked people. And I'm like, what does that mean? I woke up this morning, I got a little thing in my neck, but what does that mean? And the idea is that if you can't turn the head and the neck, they won't follow. And I don't know a lot about livestock, Brother Steve, but I got to imagine that if you're trying to lead a horse or you're trying to lead some cattle, the thing you want to do is you want to be able to turn their neck in a direction to get the rest of their body to follow. And God says that his people would not turn their neck. And so if their head won't follow, their hearts won't follow. Their actions didn't follow. And I read this verse this past week, and you know what? It could have been written yesterday. It could have been written yesterday. Hezekiah was born into a challenging home environment. He was raised in a morally bankrupt and negative society. And so think about Hezekiah for a second. If you're Hezekiah and you're getting brought up in that, and no one's worshiping God, no one's following God, if I'm Hezekiah, I'm loaded with great excuses to not follow God. I mean, I've got them, right? My home is a wreck. I can blame it on my family, all the wrong things I do and all the trouble I get into, I can blame it on my family. Or if nobody buys that story, I can blame it on my environment, my society. I can blame all these wrong things and the trouble I get into on my family and my society, and maybe a combination of both. And everybody would understand because now I'm excused from it because, well, he had some hard knocks growing up as a kid. He had some rough stuff to go through in the neighborhood he grew up in. Let me share with you. Hezekiah takes the throne at 25 years of age, and he boldly faces the challenges of his day, and he bravely implements godly change. This young man stepped to the throne and recognized that God had called him to that moment, to that time, for a great purpose. He doesn't give in to peer pressure. He doesn't take the easy way out. He courageously stands up to the wrong around him. And look at 2 Kings 18, verse 3, it says this. It says that Hezekiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord. I love that. What it also tells us is that Hezekiah didn't just think about doing something right. It doesn't say that Hezekiah, kind of felt convicted about doing something right. This verse says that he actually did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Why? Because Hezekiah wanted something better for himself. Because Hezekiah wanted something better for his family. Hezekiah wanted something better for the people around him. And you know what Hezekiah understood? That requires action. It requires action. It doesn't require you just sitting in a row and hearing stuff and kind of feeling bad. It doesn't require us just reading through a few pages and going, I really ought to, I should, I ought to think about doing. He actually did something. He took action. Matter of fact, watch what Hezekiah does. I mean, this guy's a brave guy. 25 years of age, he's stepping in. 2 Kings chapter 18:4, it says that he removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars. And that may not mean a whole lot to you if you haven't read Old Testament stuff, but you have to understand that the things that he was tearing down were idol worship. It was stuff that was going on that was so against God. He just walked in and he says, you know what? We're not going to hem and haw around. We're going to rip this stuff down. We're breaking this up. And then he says that he cut down the wooden image and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses... Anybody remember that story? Anybody remember the story? Numbers, Gage raised his hand. He remembers that story. Numbers 21. If you want to read the backstory to that, you'd have to go to Numbers 21. They were going through the wilderness, and God was so irritated with the children of Israel because all they did was whine and complain. So warning to all of us, be careful about the whining and complaining. But he sent, I just thought about this. He sent serpents. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, Brandon and Chris will have to tell you a little bit about that later, about the snakes they've been encountering over the summer. But and I'm not trying to make any connection to this, so please don't. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying that was them. That was back then. But they were going through the wilderness and they were complaining to God about God. They were complaining about Moses. So God says, you know what? I'm kind of sick of this. I'm going to get them to kind of just dial it down a little bit. And so he sends these fiery serpents in among the children of Israel, and they get bit. And then God tells Moses, hey, by the way, I'm not going to just let them die without hope. I'm not going to let them just suffer without the ability to turn their eyes and to be healed. And he tells Moses, hey, I want you to build a bronze serpent. I want you to make a bronze serpent. And whoever gets bitten, if they look at this bronze serpent, if they will look up, they'll be healed. And we won't go into all the detail about the imagery that God was already giving to us about his own son being lifted up and being focused on and looked at for our own personal spiritual healing. That's there. That's what God was trying to get us to understand. But what was interesting is these Israelites, they had been worshiping this bronze serpent since then. That's what that verse says. For until those days, the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nehushtan. Nehushtan. They gave it a name. And if I don't know if any of you have some references as to kind of what that name means. It actually literally means, hold on to your seats, this is creative, bronze thing. That's what it means. Yeah, no credit for originality, no credit for creativity there. They called it bronze thing for 700 years, if you do the math. Back 700 years, they continued to worship this bronze thing. And so Hezekiah pulls all this down. And he goes on to restore the temple. The temple had been neglected, had been just kind of ripped to shreds. He restores the temple and he resurrects the worship of the true God. See, Hezekiah had a deep desire to honor God, and he knew, if I'm going to honor God, I have to do something. I have to take action. And this morning, before we push forward, I want us to grab a couple of things from Hezekiah's example real quick. I just want us to kind of press pause for a moment, and let's think about what's happened already in the life of this young man, Hezekiah. Let me share with you a couple things real quick. First of all, it's never wrong to do what's right. It's never wrong to do what's right. Secondly, it's never too late to make a change. It's never too late to make a change. Too many people convince themselves, well, this is the way I am, this is the way I'll always be, and God says, no. That's not the way it has to be. That's not the way it has to be. And so at this point in Hezekiah's story, I don't know about you, but we'd be tempted to believe that Hezekiah lived happily ever after, right? I mean, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and he lived happily ever after. That's the story, right? I mean, that's the story I want. And you know why we want that story for Hezekiah? Because that's the story you and I want for ourselves. We want that story. We want that, God, I did what you wanted me to do with that choice and that relationship, with my finances, with my family, with all these kinds of things. We want that. We want to say, God, I got my temper under control, my tongue under control, I got my spending under control, I got my eating habits under control, I got all these bad habits under control. God, I've done all this stuff. God, I stepped away from the wrong things. I broke from my bad habits. I tore down the idols in my life. And that's the story we want. God, look, I've done all this stuff. I get happily ever after, right? God, I've done all this stuff that you wanted me to do. I've been obedient to you, and now I get the smooth road. I get the path with no problems, right? Show of hands, how many of that's been your experience? That you started doing the things God wanted you to do, and everything worked out perfect. Like life was just grand, and you never had another problem after you started taking steps to do what God wanted you to do. Anybody in that category? Good, because if a hand went up, I was gonna pull you aside and play, please counsel me as to how that can happen, because it's not happening in my life. That's what we expect. But let me share with you, that's not what we experienced. That's not what Hezekiah experienced either. I want you to watch this next verse. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 1. Look what it says. After all that Hezekiah had so faithfully done, after all that he had done, he had restored the temple, he had restored true worship, he had torn down all the idols, he had made this heart decision to follow God with all of his being, to honor God with all that he was. He made this, and look what happens. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah. Wow. Anybody relate to that? Anybody relate to that? You're moving in the right direction. You're taking some faith steps. You're trusting that what God's telling you, you're taking Him at His word. You're trying to do what He's asked you to do. You're actually doing something. You're not just thinking about it or feeling that you should. You're actually doing something. And all of a sudden, instead of getting more openings, you're met with more obstacles. And instead of having the peace that you would really think you would have, sometimes you have more pressure. Have any of you ever had one of those, you ever done one of those, really, God? Really? Ever done that before? Okay, cool. Somebody shake your head, because I was hoping I wasn't the only one here this morning that went, really? Serious? Like, you've called us to do this, and we're stepping out, and this is what we get met with? We get met with another bill, or we get met with another illness, or we get met with another, job release, or we get met with, really, God? Is that how this is going to go? Let me ask you, in those moments when you're courageously trying to walk the road that God's asked you and called you to walk with Him, and the road doesn't seem to be getting any easier, what goes through your mind? What goes through your mind? I'll pick on me. I'll be honest. You know what goes through my mind in those moments? What's the use? I'm just being honest. What's the use? Why try? Why trust? Why walk this path if it's just full of more hurdles and heartache? Why do this? And those thoughts may have crept into Hezekiah's mind for a moment. But what he does in the face of these hurdles and in the face of this heartache is so needful for me this morning. And I think it's really needful for you. I want you to see what he does in the face of these hurdles and this heartache. 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 1, it says this. And so it was when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Boy, that's a great first step. I don't want us to stop there. We skip down to verses 14 and 15. It says this, that Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers of Sennacherib. And that message basically said, hey, Hezekiah, we're coming. And you can either just kind of give up and lay down and let us take over Judah, or you can put up a fight, but it's not going to go well. He gets that message from the messengers of Sennacherib, and he reads it. And it says, and Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. Then Hezekiah prayed before the Lord. And I want you to understand how this probably is played out, because a lot of times we think about prayer, and I don't know about you, we talk about prayer, and a lot of times we think about, I'm going to sit in a nice chair, and I'm going to just kind of fold my hands, and I'm just going to talk to God a little bit. This was a man that spread this letter out, and it was on scrolls. Understand that he spread this letter out in the house of God before God, and he just pressed his face into the ground, and he prayed, and he worshiped. And I want us to understand that that when these things happen, when you're trying to step in the direction that God's calling you to step, and you believe that with all your heart, this is the way God's calling you to go, and He's directing you to go, it's consistent with what His Spirit's speaking to your heart, and it's consistent with what His Word says, and you start stepping in that, and you're met with hurdles, and you're met with heartache, I want you to understand this is what we need to do. You need to pray passionately, and you need to worship publicly. And sometimes that's not the step we go. We tend to kind of back away. Hezekiah turned to God and he prayed passionately and he worshiped publicly. Think about that. Think about what the other people in the kingdom of Judah must have thought as they saw the king walking out of the palace with all of his robes torn, and he's just wearing the burlap bag, and he's walking with ash, and his face is turned down, and his heart is just broken, and he prays before God. See, I want you to understand that there's other people wanting to know if the God you claim is really a father that can be trusted. They want to know that. They're looking at your life and going, hey, you've been doing the God thing for a while, and it ain't going good for them. Now what are they going to do? I want you to look at what Hezekiah does next. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 2 and 3, it tells us, when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his leaders and mighty men. And this doesn't sound like a big deal maybe. It's just like one of those couple verses in the middle of an Old Testament book we don't care about, whatever. We read right through it, but I want you to understand, look at what Hezekiah didn't do. He didn't isolate himself. He didn't run away from his problems. He didn't believe he had to face it all alone. Matter of fact, he didn't believe he had to have all the answers himself. Instead, he ran to godly people and he sought godly counsel and he got godly support. He understood the need to surround himself with people that had wise, godly hearts, not run away from those people, not isolate himself and because I'll be honest with you, you know what happens when we isolate ourselves? We dig a deeper pit. We dig a deeper hole. And Hezekiah understood, I don't want to run away from God's people. I don't want to run away from godly support. I don't want to run away from godly counsel. I'm going to run to them. And so what do we pull from this? When things fall apart, intentionally put yourself in the presence of godly people. Intentionally put yourself. Because here's the thing, you guys. I know some of you well enough to know that we may want godly support and godly counsel, but we don't go seeking it. We just kind of hole up. And we kind of dig our hole, and we expect somebody to come kind of beating down the door and kind of rescuing us from the hole. I want you to understand, Hezekiah understood the need to surround himself, to reach to his leaders, to his mighty men, to godly counsel. He understood the need to run to those people and get their support, and get their counsel, get their insight. Finally, I want you to see where Hezekiah's full faith and trust rested, even in these powerfully pressing and agonizing moments, because you got to imagine Hezekiah's heart's just being torn out of his chest. He's done everything he knew was right to do, and he was just about to be attacked by one of the most vicious armies on the face of the earth at the moment. He'd done everything in his heart to be obedient to God, and it wasn't all about, like a track record for Hezekiah. It was about just loving God and trying to be obedient and seeing his life and seeing his family's life and seeing his culture turned around. So he was doing everything he thought was right as a leader, as a father, as a king, as a brother, he was doing everything he thought was right. And now his heart's just being torn out of his chest as they're facing this imminent attack. And I want you to understand, I want you to see the words that Hezekiah speaks to the people that day. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 7. This is Hezekiah's words. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor, listen to this, before all the multitude that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. And there had to be somebody in Hezekiah's audience that day going, Hezekiah, you need to get more sleep, man. You got to get a little more rest. You got to get some glasses or something, because I don't know if you've done the math, but they outnumber us like 20-1. I don't know what you're seeing, but I'm not seeing it. But Hezekiah boldly proclaims the truth. And it's a truth that I want to encourage you this morning. I want you to encourage every one of us. He steps forward and he boldly proclaims the truth that every single person here this morning needs to courageously claim and cling to. Look what he says. He says with him, Sennacherib, that big king, that mean king, that guy from Assyria, he has an arm of flesh. He didn't deny the strength of the king of Assyria. He didn't deny the strength of the army of Assyria. He said, they got an arm of flesh. They're strong. That's something to be dealt with. But listen to this. He says, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. Plural. Battles, plural. Which means that we have a God that doesn't just step to the plate and help us for that moment. He's never going away. He's always there. He will never leave us nor forsake us. And for some reason, we believe that whatever I'm facing, that army that I'm facing, that battle I'm facing, that struggle I'm facing, that this is so big and it's so overwhelming. And God says, wait a second. I'm here to help you and to fight your battle. And listen, I don't want you to miss this last part of verse 8, because listen to what happens as Hezekiah steps forward and he speaks these words of courage. It says, and the people were strengthened by the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. You see, your battles aren't just there for you. They're not just there for you. As much as you feel like you're the one being picked on, and you're the one that's struggling, and you're the one that's going under, and you're the one, poor me, and this is hard on me, and God, what do you got to show me? And I want you to understand that those battles aren't there just for you. Those battles are there for others to be strengthened and encouraged from as well. They're looking at you. They're gaining strength and encouragement in their walk with the Lord as well. And what you believe about God and what you do and what you speak has incredible influence. And as Christians, if we don't have what it takes to step up and say, you know what? This is hard, but my God is bigger. This is tough, but my God is tougher. This is just difficult, but my God is more powerful. Understand that what you do and what you speak has incredible influence. You can strengthen people or you can sink them. Much like that shipwreck that we saw a little bit earlier. That your life may just serve as warning instead of encouraging direction for people in their lives and their walk with the Lord. As we wrap up this morning, here's the things I want us to know, but here's the thing that's more important. Here are some things that I know God wants us to do. And if all this morning was just kind of a note-taking, and you're not convicted towards an action-taking, we're kind of missing the point this morning. But here's what God wants us to do from the example of King Hezekiah. First of all, remember, it's never wrong to do what's right. Now let me share with you, it's rarely easy, but it's never wrong. It's never wrong. It's never too late to make a change. If you're still breathing air, God is still there to help you make that change, whatever that may be in your life. And maybe it's whole-scale change, or maybe it's you've just strayed off the path and you got to allow God to bring you back in the direction and the place that He wants you to be. Let me share with you, when met with life's battles, when met with life's hurdles and heartaches, pray passionately and worship publicly. Don't retreat. Don't throw in the towel. Pray passionately. Let God know the things that are just pressing on your heart. Let Him understand where you're at in all of this. And it's not that He needs, to be enlightened. He knows you. He knows where you're at. But sometimes it's good, the old saying, confession is good for the soul. It's good for us to admit to God, I'm really struggling, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm not. I'm really under some pressure right now, God, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm not. When met with life's battles, when met with life's hurdles and heartache, put yourself in the presence of godly people. Don't run away from those people. God's put them there in your life for a reason. And as much as God knows the inner workings of your heart and your situations, we don't. People don't always. Sometimes people don't know all that you're struggling with or dealing with. Put yourself in the presence of godly people. And finally, when met with life's battles and when met with life's heartaches and hurdles, boldly trust God and bravely testify of His presence and His promises and His power. Because you know why? We need to hear that. You need to hear that. You need to hear yourself say, God, I know this is big, but You're bigger. You need to hear that. And what's amazing is there's other people around you in your life that need to hear that too. As we prepare to close this morning, let me ask you, what hurdles and heartaches are you facing right now? What are those things that just seem to be, you're just bumping up against the wall right now? What are those things? And let me follow that question up with this. What are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? I never doubt God's activity on our behalf. What I doubt in my life is my own willingness to act when I'm supposed to take that step that I'm supposed to take. By the way, if you're wondering how Hezekiah's story ends, 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 22, it says this: the Lord saved Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem. You know, the Lord's interested in you. He's interested in your influence. He's interested in people around you. Brother Steve shared with us, he's interested in cornfields. He's interested in saving cornfields if it means it's going to build some faith in His people and maybe draw some people to faith that aren't otherwise. He's interested. The Lord saved Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem. And here's the truth that we need to know. And if you can hear anything else this morning, hear this. That what you need to know and what you need to remember and what needs to drive your next step is the fact that God wins, and so do His people. That has to drive how you think and how you feel about things and what you do. Because if it's all about, I'm going to lose this battle, or I'm going to lose this, we're forgetting who our God is, how faithful He is, how powerful He is, how strong He is. Let me ask you this morning, are you letting God help you fight your battles? Because I will tell you, you will lose some if you fight them in your own strength. I'm going to tell you that. Just flat out, you will lose. Because you're not capable. Because the enemy that's coming against you isn't that job layoff. The enemy that's coming against you isn't that health issue. The enemy that's coming against you isn't that financial issue. The enemy that's coming against you, he has a name, and his name is Satan. And he wants to do everything he can to destroy your confidence and to destroy your courage and to make you look like this measly Christian that doesn't have a father that loves them and that you can trust. Because if he can get you doing that, guess what? Everybody else that might be inclined to turn towards Christ are now convinced otherwise. That's all he wants. He knows he can't take your salvation. You're secure in the hand of your Father. If you've been born again, you can't be unborn. Right? Everybody understand that? If you've been born again, you can't be unborn. It's not practical. It's not possible in the physical realm. It's not possible in the spiritual realm. But what Satan can do, he can't rob your salvation, but what he can do is try to deflect your testimony in such a way that it may keep others from coming to Christ. And let me share with you, how you face your battles is what testifies to the strength of your God. Because we can all praise the Lord when the corn's good. I can, and the bank account's fat, and everybody's healthy. God's great. But what about when that slips away? What about when I'm trying to do everything God has asked me to do, and it gets harder, not easier? Now what? Now I'm going to pray passionately, and I'm going to worship publicly. Because how dare I turn my back on a God that has never turned His back on me? And I'm going to put myself in the presence of godly people. I'm going to find somebody I can lean on that God's put in my life to say, you know what, right now, I know God has me, but right now I just need a friend to walk with me for a few steps. Because I'm weak. And I'm also going to stand before a congregation of people and in the midst of my friends and boldly tell them how strong my God is. And bravely testify that His presence is there, His promises are secure, and His power is unlimited. That's how we step past the hurdles and heartache. Let me ask you this morning, are you teamed up with God? Because Hezekiah said something that's really powerful. He said that we have more with us than they have with them. My question is, are you with God? Are you teamed up with Him? And that doesn't come from just showing up in hearing or feeling something, there's an activity you have to intentionally join with God. And you know what it takes to do that? Belief. I got to believe that Jesus Christ went to a cross so that I can be on God's side. I got to believe that He went to that cross to take care of the sin that was in my life, that will keep me from a relationship with a holy God. I got to believe that He did that for me because He loved me and still loves me. Let me give you the summary statement of King Hezekiah. If you're in 2 Kings chapter 18, here's how the summary statement for King Hezekiah goes. Verse 5, it says, "The King Hezekiah trusted in the Lord God of Israel." And listen to this. "So that after him was none like him among the kings of Judah, nor were there before him." Isn't that amazing? That God said, hey, he did what was right in my sight. And there had never been a king before him, and there was never a king after him that loved and followed. And it goes on to say this. It says that Hezekiah held fast to the Lord. Which means in the middle of those hurdles, in the middle of that heartache, he didn't give up on God. He ran to God. It says he did not depart from following Him, but kept His commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. The Lord was with him, and he prospered wherever he went. Wow, what a story. What a story of a guy raised in a horrible environment, but understands God had called him to that place and that moment for a particular purpose, and he stepped up and he became the man of God and the king of God that God had wanted him to be. This morning we're going to close, and before we do, I know Andrew. Andrew's he desires to do something this morning, but before we give him an opportunity to do that, I want him to come forward. I want him to share what God has already done in his life, real quick. So Andrew, if you'd come forward this morning. Andrew had spoken to me a while back about his desire to be baptized and become a member here at Cornerstone, and I told Andrew I'd like to give him an opportunity this morning as the church encourages him, desires for him to take that step to share